Let's go out in the world and let's learn how to actually communicate with outside resources by using HTTP protocol, which is something that is being widely used in the internet and actually is the basis of the internet as we know it today. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. First of all, what even is HTTP and what can we know from the get-go? It is working since 1999 and it's actually as old as the internet itself. It introduces a client-server model. What does it mean? It means that there is one party that is client asking for some resources, uploading resources, and there is a server that is actually the owner of those resources. The most common case is your browser acting as a client, and then the URL or the web address that you are then sending your request to is the server that is then handling your particular request. Entirety of the internet uses it, as I've said, and then you use it every time you open up a website, any type of website that you use. Whether it's on your mobile phone, whether it's on your PC, or whether it's just downloading a game from the app shop, it is going to be using HTTP protocol underneath. So let's talk a little bit. How can you actually make a request within HTTP protocol, which stands for actually Hypertext Protocol. Okay, so HTTP request, what is it made out of? So first of all, we've got a line of the request that is containing the type of the request, the address, and the HTTP version. Right now we are on HTTP version 1.1. Then we've got the headers, which contain information about the authorization, the data that we are accepting, the language that we are accepting, because it is underneath very different whenever we're talking about accepting data in English or, for example, in Chinese, because there we have different data sets and character sets that we need to handle. So it is not as simple as one would think. And of course, we've got the body of the request, so the data that we want to actually send over to the server that we are then making a request to. And this is very important because the body is actually where we put all the data, right? So we'll be using body quite a lot within this particular context, because at the end of the day, we always want to send some data to the server so that we can get something in return. For example, if you are going to be asking something within your browser and you use a request, then what you get in return is HTTP files, but what you are sending is, for example, the data about your device and what type of data you actually accept. So for example, if you're on mobile, you'll be sending a different request than on a desktop, because as you can tell, the data is very much different whenever you're showing it on your mobile or on your desktop. So let's go into the types of the requests that we can make. There are 5 that are, let's say, most popular, and they are all defined within an RFC. So the RFC is actually other way of me telling you that this is all regulated and there is some strict requirements if you want to follow HTTP protocol. It's not something that is just there, it is heavily regulated. So if you want to say that you follow this protocol, then you need to use those type of requests. So first type is GET. So this is just asking for data, for example, for a web page. So whenever you open up a web page, you are doing a GET. It means that you are asking to get something in return. Then we've got POST, which is for adding data like registering a user. PUT, which is substituting whole data object like a whole user. So for example, if I have made a POST request that has added a user, then I made a PUT request for the same user, then I will substitute this whole data object. We've got delete, which is pretty straightforward, it's just deletion of data. And then we've got patch, which is updating a part of the data object, like username of an user. Of course, data operations are very costly, so if we want to make a substitution of just the user email of the username, then of course we don't want to substitute the whole object, we want to substitute just one single field. Then, when we've got our request, now let's talk about responses, because if we get a request, then of course we get a response to it. And actually the responses are mostly identified by the codes that they have and the codes that they mean. So the famous 404 that you can sometimes get, 403, 401, 500, let's learn what they actually mean. Because of course this is also very heavily regulated. And if you are getting a 404 from any other place, it should always mean the same thing. So for the response codes, first of all, we've got the hundreds that begin with 1 and it's informational on a status code that actually tells us something that request is still being processed, please wait, etc. The 200s are for the success of the request. 300s, it means that an action is required to finish your request. 400s, something wrong with your request, so it means that there is your fault, right? So 404 actually stands for resource not found. It means that you are asking for something that is not there. So always remember, if you find a 4 in the request in the beginning, or rather in the response, it means that you did something wrong. However, it's pretty different for 500s, because 500s means that there's something wrong with the server, so the place where you are putting your data into. So with that being said, we know that there are some requests, we know the body, etc. But there are some data types that are being used to store the data that we are sending in the body. And the most popular one that is out there is a JSON. So JSON is a text format that starts with a bracket and ends with a bracket, curly bracket to be precise. And then within it, we've got our body, right? All the JSON fields are in quotes. Then after a colon, the string values are in quotes. And then we've got a separation. It's a semicolon between each field. And then at the end of it, we've got the numerical values that are just the name of the field is in quotes, but the number itself is never in quotes. So if we want to use a numerical value, we need to remember to never use a quote. Of course, this is just one of the data types that we can use. There are more, but JSON is the most popular one, meaning that if we are asking or talking to a REST API or anything of sorts that I will talk about in just a second, we can always expect, or rather most of the times, let's say 90%, we can expect a JSON out of any sort of REST API. And what is a REST API? It's actually a layer between a client and a server. So essentially, it's a way to communicate between two parties. So it gives us a documentation or a way to talk with the server in such a way that we can communicate. So it is, for example, it tells us, yeah, you can ask this particular resource, and then I will go fetch the data for you and respond in a specific manner. So REST APIs is actually the let's say entry point for any sort of request that is text-based. And this is actually one of the most common ways to give programmers a way to be using and communicating with any sort of a server, because it is also unified. This one is not as strictly monitored as RFCs for HTTP because it's not a protocol, it's not in any way regulated. However, there are some ways that you need to follow in order to be able to say that your API is actually a REST API. Right now, what we will be doing in just a second is trying to communicate with a REST API, and in the future, when we are talking about Spring, I will show you how to write a REST API yourself. So with that theory, we've got it out of the way. Let's get onto the problem of how to actually communicate with any sort of API or call anything from the level of Java. But that will come in the next video, so I can't wait to see you there. Stay tuned and see you in the next one.